Before Mr. Tenenbaum begins, I'm going to take a little judicial license, if you will, to explain to the gallery that normally, with regard to the prosecution's introduction of the rifle, the defense would file a motion in limine to seek to exclude the evidence on grounds of defective documentation. But because we've suspended the rules of evidence for this mock trial, it was admitted. Any questions about the probity of the evidence will go towards the weight of the evidence. With regard to the other physical evidence offered by the prosecution, normally defense would file a motion in limine to seek to exclude this evidence on chain of custody grounds, but because we have suspended the rules for this mock trial, they were admitted. Any questions about the probity of that evidence will go towards the weight of the evidence. Autopsy report, normally defense would file a motion in limine to seek to exclude that evidence because the autopsy was not performed in Texas and in accordance to state protocols because we've suspended the rules of evidence for the trial, was admitted. Any questions about probity will go towards the weight of the evidence. Autopsy photos and x-rays, normally a motion in limine would seek to exclude those on grounds of defective documentation, but we suspended the rules and so they were admitted. Again, probity will go towards the weight. And I think that's all I can talk about. There was no discussion about evidence seized from the Payne residence at this point. Has there been any discussion of that? All right. Very well. And I think we now may proceed to Mr. Tenenbaum's summary and opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. I also want to thank Dean Gouda for putting this program on and dealing with the various dramas that led up, including this today. I am also responsible for talking about ethics so that those who are here can get at least one unit with respect to continuing legal education. And I want to mention with respect to that, there are really two fundamental issues that exist with respect to trial lawyers, or any lawyer for that matter. And that is, we are officers of the court, and we vouch for the credibility of our witnesses. Just don't put people on the stand who sound good, who walk around with movies. We didn't hear one word today from the way cases are actually solved. And what is that? You go to the crime scene and see who was there and what they saw. Wouldn't that help? The second aspect of what we do, and this is a critical ethical issue, is that we put on the stand witnesses and we make arguments to courts where we inform the court that there is an opposition case on point against us, and we will now try and distinguish it based upon the facts of the instant matter. Not one place in 2014, after knowing the entire assault that was made by expert scientists who had nothing to do with books being published or sides taken, whether or not they're involved with people who are totally committed to the government, the Warren Report, and the House Committee on Assassinations, or otherwise. These are your scientists. There's not one word in either of these articles that you heard from the witness that in any way brings in all of this tsunami of critique. And it's just not the critique, it's the notion they have totally debunked the science upon which a major prong of the one bullet theory rests. It's not just the placement of bodies. It had to do with the notion that has been espoused by Mr. Haig and his colleagues, contrary to the metallurgic scientific community, that the fragments from Connolly's wrist matched the complete bullet, the so-called magic bullet. Commission Exhibit 399. And that the bullets from President Kennedy's skull matched the fragments. The scientists have said categorically, which is the reason why the FBI shut down its lab and prohibited FBI agents from testifying, was because you can't match a fragment to a fragment, and you can't match a fragment to a bullet. Not one word did we hear about that. And if I weren't here telling you this all sounds great. Let's go home. I mean, after all, 3 shots were fired. The government told us that. We know the government doesn't lie to us. They tell us the truth all the time. In 1992, there was a President Kennedy Records Act. And there was an advisor, there was a group that was formed to implement it, the Assassination Record Review Board. And the Congress, when it passed the law, gave the executive intelligence agencies 25 years to produce the documents. 25 years. If I were in this courtroom with His Honor, and there was the notion that there was important evidentiary matter in various memos, he may give me a week. And if I couldn't deal with it in a week, I would have to show cause on the record why I couldn't do it. Here are 25 years. I worked for that committee. I didn't apply for the job. My boss, who was a legend, the district attorney in New York County, which is Manhattan. Each of the boroughs, as you know, is his own county in New York City. And I went to work there, and I would have stayed there for the rest of my life. But he suddenly passed away. And while I was there, I tried over 200 cases to verdict. Not dispositions. When you call a juror, that counts like a trial. All through the course of it, I ran the criminal courts. I was in charge. I also ran the Homicide Bureau, where I tried most of those murder cases as a prosecutor. Never, ever do you try a case, do you present witnesses without giving the full picture. And if you know what you're doing when you're a prosecutor, you bring it out on direct testimony. It's not something you hide and hope the other side missed it. That's the whole issue about ethics. And I'll repeat once again, what Mr. Hague wrote, without any attribution, without any quotes, without disavowing any part of it, he wrote in December of 2014, skull shattered in a manner similar to the damage observed in JFK's head. Well, we know that's not the case. We have the photographic evidence. The other aspect of, and very briefly, I want to make sure everybody gets their credit, is the history of America. There are 2 major cases that were tried by the founders, by 2 of the founders. One was the case of what we knew, what we learned was the Boston Massacre in 1770 near the Customs House in Boston. And that was where a group of colonists, Bostonians, got together. They saw the redcoats there, and there was a melee, and shots were fired, and people were shot. And nobody would defend the British. John Adams did. Because he believed in a free country, everybody's entitled to a lawyer, to have a fair trial. And he said in that case, he said, you know, facts are stubborn things, he said to the jury, which were all hostile. This was the predicate event to the Great War, our revolution. And he says, facts are stubborn things because whatever your passions, whatever your inclinations may be, or what you want things to be, are not altered by the facts, by immutable facts and the evidence. He wound up getting 6 of those 8 acquitted. And his cousin Sam Adams wasn't crazy about that because he didn't care one way or the other. This was an act of propaganda in order to encourage those to participate in the revolution. But he endured that because he knew he was doing the right thing. The other case is tried in 1784 called Rutgers v. Waddington by Alexander Hamilton. And that was tried in the mayor's court in downtown Manhattan. And in that particular case, Waddington was a Tory. And when the British took over New York City in 1776, all of the shops, stores were taken over. And the British handed them out to Tories. So why would Hamilton do this? Hamilton, when he was at what they call King's College, that was now called Columbia, which was south of Wall Street, he was pamphleteering for the revolution. He formed an artillery militia of fellow students. But he saved the dean when Washington's army was being chased by General Howe, across the East River, and Washington wound up in Harlem Heights. He's trying to save what was of then the Continental Army, our army. And he met Hamilton, who had saved the dean of King's College because he was a Tory. He saved his life. After the war, and Hamilton, by the way, which unfortunately is not taught enough in American history, was actually at Yorktown in combat, along with Lafayette. And once they broke through Cornwallis's defense, Cornwallis said the world will never be the same again. That was Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton in 1784 did not want Tories to be discriminated against. That was his understanding of who we are. And he argued in that case, and the reason I mention it is in 1784, he argued the following: that New York State, after the war, passed a statute called, it was a criminal trespass statute. And what they wanted to do was make sure that the Tories suffered by operating these businesses. And so he argued that that law was invalid because there was a law of war that permitted the occupying force to do exactly what the British did. And so he argued in 1784 what we call judicial review, which became the law of the land in 1803 when Marbury v. Madison was passed. And Chief Judge John Marshall made the courts a true equal partner of the legislative and the executive branch, so that courts, which we all know now, beyond any and all doubt, would be able to look at statutes and determine whether or not they were in fact constitutional. And if not, they would be stricken. Now, the last case I'm going to mention with respect to the ethical issues is a case called Brady v. Maryland, which was decided in May of 1963. And in Brady v. Maryland stands for the proposition, shocking that this case had to be passed by the Supreme Court, that when the prosecution of the government is in possession of exculpatory evidence, this is all exculpatory, wasn't it? All these critiques, the devastating nature of NAA and comparative bullet analysis, as the rest of this evidence is that we'll get to. Not one word from the government about the nature of this exculpatory evidence. So the court said in Brady v. Maryland that when the government has exculpatory evidence, that's evidence favorable to the accused. It has a duty to hand it over at a reasonable time so that the defense can respond to it. Because to do otherwise, in fact, to do otherwise will be a contrivance of a conviction, which was nothing more than a pretense to find the defendant guilty. The contrivance of a trial, which was a fake. Knowing that there was exculpatory evidence, he didn't get it over to the defense. What do we have here in this case? We have a contrivance of investigations. We have a contrivance of a predetermined outcome. And the pretense is that in some fashion, the investigations would be legitimate. I left that committee. I told first the committee not to hire me. They said, why? I said, because the Congress works on the basis of compromise, at best. Most Congresses work on the basis if you recover the forward fumble, that's progress. And I said, I don't know anything about the assassination. I didn't get into it. As a matter of fact, in all the major murder cases that I prosecuted, I debunked the notion of the conspiracy of the police and the DA's office. No evidence. It was the last refuge of the defense. Cases were overwhelming. And I said to them, if push comes to shove and lightning strikes and we find critical evidence, you're going to run and hide and you're not going to do your job. I'm not wired that way. I will never compromise on search for truth. We promise we will not interfere. In 4 months, vital evidence was found with respect to some of those responsible for this assassination. They're in the government. It was mentioned over here that Oswald allegedly was in Mexico City on October 1st. Government was interested in Oswald, evidently, on October 1st. I mean, after all, why weren't they? When Oswald came to America, he was met by George de Mohrenschildt, who was a longtime CIA operative. Any CIA operatives ever meet you at the airport and find an apartment for you and get you a job? So here he was on October 1st. They said Oswald went into the Russian embassy and he called up the Cuban embassy. Same alleged Oswald who asked for a Russian interpreter who was working in Minsk in a radar factory where he met a KGB colonel's daughter, Marina, and got married. Spoke fluent Russian. But here's the kicker. The CIA thought this was so significant that they put out a telex worldwide. And on the telex was a person who was not the historical Lee Harvey Oswald. They had a description of this person. It wasn't of the historical Oswald. So the third-ranking member of the committee was called in and asked. This was David Phillips. And he was asked, what happened? He said, well, our photographic equipment broke down. Well, where's the tape? Where is the tape? We tape everybody in communist embassies, they tape us. He said, well, we recycled our tapes every 6 or 7 days. So if you were asked, where was the tape on November 1st, your answer would be, wasn't around. It was recycled. This is a CIA that gets a blank check from the Congressional Oversight Committees for hundreds of millions of dollars. But they're recycling this tape that they thought was so important that they sent out this telex. Would it offend your common sense if I suggested to you that there was never a correction sent out? They knew they had the wrong person. But here's the rub. This tape that was allegedly destroyed resurfaces in a memo from the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. And he says on November 23rd, written on Saturday, the day after the assassination, the following in substance. Our agents, there were 7 of them, who have been questioning Lee Harvey Oswald for the past 17 hours, this is a pre-Miranda case, have listened to the tape made inside the Russian embassy by a person who identified himself as Lee Henry Oswald, which is the name that was used on the telex, which is a file that the CIA had. And they categorically state that the voice on the tape is not the voice of Lee Harvey Oswald. Another example, here's the FBI telling us, another example of a false narrative. Now, there have been many false narratives in this case, regrettably. And probably one of the most egregious, there are many we'll get to, is this one bullet theory. The one bullet theory rested in large measure on the scientific evidence, which you now know has been debunked. How bad, by the way, was the scientific evidence? Think about this. The FBI had people out there testifying because of this brouhaha about how great neutron activation analysis was. And that would tell you everything you needed to know. You measure the antimony content, that's the hardening element on a bullet. And if that matches, everything is kosher, that's it. Countless people suffered abuse by the government who were the victims of having this evidence adduced against them. Where's the ethics there? Every one of them found guilty should have a new trial based upon the newly discovered evidence. That's the system that I lived in. You don't try a case because you have probable cause. That is, it's likely that the defendant committed the crime for which he was charged, likely. You convict only because you have evidence beyond any and all doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt is this great thing we do in the law, this gymnastic game. Well, I have a doubt, but is it really reasonable? Of course it's reasonable if you have a doubt on the evidence. We're talking about depriving people of their freedom. And Adams has set the tone for this. John Adams is the second president of the United States, the first president to sit in the Oval Office. He set the tone for this when he said, better 8 or 9 people who were charged and convicted. Better if we find someone unjustly accused and exonerate them, because we celebrate freedom. And where it doesn't exist, we use every mechanism we can to ensure that it will exist. So with respect to the one bullet theory, let's deal first with neutron activation analysis. We know that it's been debunked. We know that the FBI shut down its lab on September 1st, 2005, prohibited all agents from ever testifying about it again. And then we have something very interesting that occurred in the case. At the end of 1963, the FBI and the Secret Service, having gone over the Zapruder film, which you're going to see this afternoon in the film that you're going to watch, it's a documentary. It was brilliantly done. And it's not a polemic. You make the decision. No one's telling you what the decision is. And the two agencies, the Secret Service and the FBI, found that in December of '63, about a month plus after the assassination, that President Kennedy and Governor Connolly were hit with 2 separate bullets. You know why? We didn't hear this. Of the 3 shots fired, according to the Warren Commission, the second shot comes too close to the first. You heard the gentleman, you saw the gentleman go through the rifling. In order to do that, after you get the first shot off, you go through the rifling. That takes 2.3 seconds. The Zapruder film shows us that the president and Connolly are hit within 1.6 seconds. So you couldn't have the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, given its rifling. After first shot, second shot, it takes 1.6 seconds for that action to occur on the hits, on the wounds, and then the third shot. So they were too close. That was done at the end of '63. So what happened? Predetermined outcome. That's no good. That means there was more than one shooter from the back. Now here's a fact you haven't heard. When Governor Connolly was first, Your Honor, forgive me for having this diagram, you can't see it. But to make sure we're kosher here, this is what it is. It's an aerial view of Dealey Plaza. Governor Connolly had 2 surgeons. One for the back wound that passed through him, and that was Dr. Robert Shaw, thoracic surgeon. And what Dr. Shaw said that very day was that the declination, the downward flight, was 27 degrees. And with all the building structures here, in what we call the northeast corner, here's the northeast corner of Houston Street and Elm. There's a complex of buildings. And in the complex of buildings, it turns out that the one building for sure that we know has a 27-degree declination. It's not the depository. It's the county records building, right here. Now, this was right away on November 22nd. There was no Warren Commission. There was no House Committee. There was no one-bullet theory. He said it was a 27-degree declination going right down from his back, exiting in the front. And lo and behold, isn't that interesting? It's that building? Because in that building, you have a direct shot. You don't have a direct shot from the depository, do you? You have an angular shot that is right to left because it's slanted. It's not direct. But in the one building where it's direct, lo and behold, exactly 27 degrees. How much better can, that's drawing the inside straight flush. You didn't hear a word about that today. Whatever happened to Brady v. Maryland? Exculpatory evidence. Whoops. That must be a sign. Okay, thank you. I'll get it. Thank you very much. Very kind. Okay. Now, so the scientists have said, when we'll finish off on the neutron activation analysis as well as the comparative bullet lead analysis, the scientists have said the very best you can say that there were small amounts of antimony present in all the fragments and bullet, and that meant that there was simply jacketed rifle ammunition, period. Quite different from what we heard. The next very important area of debunking this one bullet theory is to look at a fact we did not hear this morning, and that is the following. Governor Connolly's wrist wound. We heard talk about that portion, of course, because it matched the NAA stuff that was going on. But what we didn't hear is the following. Connolly was seated in the car. With his right hand, he was holding his Stetson. And when President Kennedy is hit at 224 frame, Zapruder frame 224, Governor Connolly is sitting straight back, and he has in his right hand the Stetson. He still has the Stetson at 230. Well, again, I'll take the lowest number. Mr. Haig was kind enough to tell us the speed of the bullet. Let's say 1,800 feet per second. Connolly, president, we know, is hit at 224. We see it as he comes around the sign. He's braced. Connolly's holding his hat. Connolly holds onto that hat up until frame 328. Now, the Zapruder film, it's 18.3 frames per second. So this is about 4 or 5 seconds we're talking about. He's holding onto his hat. How can that be? The radial nerve was shattered in his hand, and the tendon that connects his left thumb was cut. Now, we've all had accidents, regrettably. Life is not without pain. You imagine holding on to something where your wrist is fractured, the tendon is cut, and the nerve is shattered. Thank you. This is a breakdown at 2:30. We see, and these are frames. If we look at each of the frames in the Zapruder film, again, it's 18.3 frames per second. And Your Honor, excuse me. Your Honor, I'm sorry. I'm not high-tech enough to have a clicker. Forgive me, okay? 1 second. We actually tried cases in New York without clickers. So when we look at 2:30, he's a little smudged here, but the president is braced at 2:30, and then there's a sequence. And you'll be able to look at all this stuff when you're in a room discussing the case. You'll take all of these with you. And Your Honor, just for the record, I am going to ask that all of these 26 of these exhibits be demarked in evidence, 1 through 26, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, and here he is, when you look at it really carefully, he has the Stetson, the white hat, upside down, and he's holding it in his right hand. Now, what's interesting about this is Governor Connolly had a surgeon handle his wrist. And his name was Dr. Charles Gregory, who has an interesting background because at the end of World War II, the last stages of World War II, he was in the Navy. But in Korea, unfortunately, there was a Korean War. And he was a field surgeon for the 1st Marine Division. And he estimated that he handled over 500 or so injuries, trauma, gunshot wounds. And he said, among other things, Connolly could not have held the hat with the damage that he endured to his right hand. Put aside the placement for a second. We're talking now reality. We're talking about a shot that fractures your wrist. What does that tell you? You can't hold on to anything. You fracture your ankle, you can't walk on it. You break your leg, you're not walking around. That's the same effect that he had on his wrist. And here's what Dr. Gregory had to say about Governor Connolly. He said, Governor Connolly could not hold his hat if his wrist was shattered by the bullet. If the government says that, the government is wrong. Governor Connolly the bullet, he said, had a rounded tip. Now, of course, you have to buy into this notion that the bullet was flipping around. Because what he said was, Connolly wasn't hitting the wrist by that bullet. He took a fragment through the wrist. It happened later. And we know from the evidence when that later was. He said, yes, sir.
30 minutes. 30 minutes.
I've done 30?
No, yes, you've done 30.
Thank you.
We got 15 minutes before the lunch break, Mr. Tanenbaum.
That gentleman is an American hero who just talked to me. His name is Josiah Thompson. He was passed off by Mr. Haig in one article as some guy with a philosophy degree. He was educated at Yale. He graduated magna cum laude. He then got his master's and PhD in philosophy at Yale. And he taught on the faculty at Yale. And then for 12 years, he was a full professor at Haverford, outside of Philly. But before he went to college, he enlisted in the Navy. And he was an officer, Lieutenant JG, junior grade. One step up from ensign. And he was a frogman. Remember the frogmen? People who are Navy SEALs who know about them understand the frogmen. They were the precursors to the frogmen, and his unit became Navy SEAL Team 2 in 1962. But while he served in 1958, he was on a military mission. And that mission was underwater demolition to clear beachheads in Lebanon for an invasion by the American United States Marine Corps. And he had to clean up that beach and make sure it was safe. And if there were enemy combatants, he took them out. And if there were any kinds of weapons, bombs, ballistics, he took that out. He had 22 men in his command. This is someone who was passed off by Mr. Haig as some kind of philosophy guy. Like, you know, staring at his navel saying, He received a major commendation for this. This is not something he walks around with, but it's something you have to respect. And before you criticize someone and pass him off as some kind of dope, understand who he is. He served his country in combat. And he knows something about weapons. And what he said was the wound, this is Dr. Charles Gregory. What he said was the wound of interest is characteristically, in my view, of an irregular missile in this case. I mean one that is distorted. Not part of a full bullet. It is in some way angular. It has edges, sharp edges, It's not rounded or pointed in the fashion of an ordinary missile. The irregularity of it tends to pick up organic material and carry it into the limb. And then Dr. Gregory told Arnold Specter, who was a young lawyer then, that's the same Arnold Specter who became a senator from Pennsylvania, who at times was a Democrat when it suited him, then he became a Republican when it suited him, and then he became a Democrat when it suited him. Here's what Dr. Gregory said. It's plausible that the bullet that struck JFK's head may have broken into more than one fragment and then took tangential directions and struck Governor Connolly's right wrist. Characteristics of the wrist injury indicated that it came from a fragment thrown off by the headshot. Now we look at Exhibit 328, and we have Exhibit 328. 328.
By the way, counsel, I want these exhibits to be laid out here during the lunch break so that if any of the folks in the gallery would like to come
Absolutely,
down
Your Honor.
without touching the exhibits, but you may look at them in your spare time so you can see them up close and personal, okay? Is that all right with counsel?
Yes, of course.
As well.
Tank, let me have the 327. I'm sorry, okay, let's look at this. Yeah, let me see the series of 313, please. We know, here's an important point. I haven't gotten to the acoustic evidence yet, nor was it ever mentioned, but when you look at the film, keep in mind that the assassins in this case did not count on two things. One is that Abraham Zapruder would actually, or anyone, would have filmed the assassination. He figured at best people would be taking photographs. And if we look at those 18.3 frames per second from where he was over here by the pergola, he almost has a direct line in the kill zone, midway down Elm Street. The evidence tells us that there were two shots to the president's head. The first one strikes him in the right front. And you know, we heard today that several times, of course, the gentleman asked Mr. Haig whether or not there was any physical evidence that could support a shot from the right front. And the answer was no. Remember that? We have evidence to show you. I will show you. You decide for yourself the physical evidence. The frames tell us the following. There were two flurries of shots. The witnesses that we're going to get to tell us the same thing. There were two flurries of shots. There were 3 shots fired initially as the car was coming down Elm. Kennedy and Connolly were hit. That is, Connolly was hit. When I say hit, he was hit in the chest. Bullet went through. That's the bullet that the FBI and Secret Service said was the second bullet from a different weapon. Different bullets. And then there was a gap. You'll hear this from the witnesses who saw this. And then there was a gap. It turns out the gap was 4.8 seconds. We know that from counting the frames. And then there was boom, boom. The first boom. The witnesses standing on the overpass bridge, which is really a railroad bridge. It's tracks on it. And the head of the Union Terminal Railroad, switching, was there. His name is S.M. Holland, Mr. Holland. And his attention and the 5 men with him who worked with him looked immediately to their left. They had a bird's eye view. The car was coming right at them. And they said that not only was our attention drawn to the stockade fence, what was then called the Knoll Hill, now the grassy knoll, but here is Mr. Holland. By the way, let me tell you quickly about Mr. Holland. He worked for 25 years for the railroad. 15 years before that, he was with another railroad. And as I said, he was in charge of the switching. Make sure the trains are on the right track so they get to A to B. And he was very friendly with Bill Decker, who was the sheriff in Dallas. And as a friend, he made him a deputy. He coached Little League. He's not the person who speaks conspiracy. This is not who Mr. Haig writes about people who disagree, well, they believe that the earth is flat. He says, when he heard those shots, here he is again, right up here in the catbird seat. Everybody see this? I don't mean to neglect the rest of the audience here. And the car is now speeding away. The shots were fired. And here he is looking back over the bridge sometime later. This is Mr. Holland. And what Mr. Holland says was that he was standing there and he thought there were 2 or 3 shots that happened up front. And he then he heard the boom, boom. After this break, he said, there was a few seconds, and then he didn't have a clock. Keep in mind, all these witnesses who we're going to talk about that were on the street, we didn't hear about one from the government today. But they weren't walking around with pads saying, there's going to be an assassination here. I better be accurate because when I'm asked by the Warren Commission, several months later, I better understand exactly what happened. These were people like you and me were there, wanted to see the president and the first lady, the governor. And this is his recollection. The first boom, his attention was drawn right to his left, as were the 5 people with him. And lo and behold, he saw smoke wafting. That's where he heard the shot. The president is hit in the front right temple. And simultaneously with that force, you will see this afternoon, if you haven't already noticed it, but pay careful attention. His head snaps back from the force simultaneously and lands, basically his body follows his head backwards. He's slumped in a position on Mrs. Kennedy's right shoulder. And then he said there was another shot that came from the rear. That rear shot. Okay. Let me have the Mary Mormon photo.
You have 5 minutes, Counselor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, what's also interesting is, another piece of exculpatory evidence, is Mary Mormon was on the south side of Elm Street. So, let me see this. Let me have this. No, just a minute. Don't be so possessive. Here, get over here for a second. Thank you. No, keep going. Go ahead. Back out. That's good. Thank you very much. On the south side of Elm is right across the street from the grassy knoll. So the north side is where Abraham Zapruder was filming. South side because Elm is the traffic's going westbound, east to west. A woman in less than a half a second at frame 315. Remember, the president gets hit in the head at 313. And the woman, Mary Mormon, takes a photograph. And exactly in this photograph, you will see an anomalous shape right where it is pointed to, here. Now this, as you look at it from the south side of the street, is to the left of where Zapruder was. To his right, but as you look at it across the street, to the left. And here is a blow-up of that shot where the anomalous shape, we're calling it, that wouldn't be there but for a person. And what gives corroboration to this is Lee Bowers. Lee Bowers is a gentleman who worked in the tower. Here's a picture of the tower. Here's a picture again of S.M. Holland. And this is the tower where Lee Bowers was. In other words, just a minute, step aside for a second. Lee Bowers is off right here in this building. So he's looking through the parking lot area, and what he testifies to is he saw 2 men arrive early. They were walking around their car. And in that, let me have the Holland, please, the diagram he made of the parking. And he said they were walking around, One he would lose sight of. Some time went by as well before the motorcade was past them. They were the only two guys there, right at the area in the stockade fence. And he said, all of a sudden, I looked up. I heard a shot, and I saw smoke coming like a flash of light. That's Lee Bauer's view right up here. Holland is saying he and his 5 colleagues, all of whom say exactly the same thing, right away, they heard the shot come from there, the 4th shot. Why do I say the 4th shot? Because of the acoustic testing that was done. There were 5 shots. The 5th shot hit the president in the back of the head. At 3:27, 3:28. The president, as you see, after getting hit in the head from the grassy knoll, is leaning slumped against Mrs. Kennedy. At 3:37, you see how far forward, 2 things we see. We see how far forward, at 3:28, the president has moved. And from 3:27 to 3:28, he moved 1.68 inches. From 3:28 to 3:29, he moved 1.91 inches. And from 3:29 to 30, he moved 2.86 inches. His head was moving forward at a rate. But we also see something else. We see that the second wound enlarged the wound from the grassy knoll, and you see the flap now, much more prominent in his head, coming over his right ear. That's what we learned from the independent, immutable facts of this case. Not opinion, not some PowerPoint presentation, but from the hardcore facts on how you solve cases. You actually talk to witnesses. Isn't that strange? You actually go to the scene and speak to people and find out what they knew and observed. All right, we left off where I mentioned about Holland. He actually made a diagram about the stockade fence, because here's what happened. Now just think of this, quick summary. We had the Mary Mormon photo right less than a half a second after that shot that hit the president right in the head. And how do we know that, by the way? The force bangs him all the way back. Do you know the backward snap of the president's head, which you're going to see this afternoon? There's not one word in the 800-plus pages of the entire Warren Commission report and the 26 volumes that are put together helter-skelter. It's not, volume 1 ballistics, volume 2 medical, it's all just documents they threw together. But there's not one word about the backward snap of the president's head. It never happened. They'd like to believe. What happened was when Holland went over to the grassy knoll area, he saw fresh cigarette butts. He saw muddy footprints that seemed to go nowhere because it had rained earlier in the morning. And a police officer had already been there, Joe Marshall Smith, who was in front of the depository, the book building, and a woman came over to him and said, "They're shooting from the bushes." He ran across the parking lot, took out a service revolver, pointed at an individual, a fellow walking away. And he said, "Stop, come back." Person stops, takes out from his possession an identification that says Secret Service. Sounded good, right? Everyone in the Secret Service in Dallas was in the motorcade. Who do you think makes up fake Secret Service documents that we know about? Holland then, when he goes there after with his 3 of the 5 who were with him, keep in mind you have the Mormon photo directly right there. You have police officer Joe Marshall Smith going over there. He makes this diagram up of the car right near the stockade fence. And he said, that's exactly where the area was that I saw the flash of light and heard the shot. As the 5 men said, but only 3 went with him to see this. Interesting evidence with respect to trying to find out, search for truth. I want to make a quick mention here of two things. This diagram indicates the CE Commission Exhibit 399, Your Honor, and a pointed tip bullet. And the reason for it is this bullet was found on a gurney that had nothing to do with the care of Connolly or President Kennedy. It was a gurney in the ER, and right at the edge of it, just with a gurney, there was a bullet. And the person who found it was a technician there. His name was Darrell Tomlinson. And Tomlinson went over and he gave it to O.P. Wright, capital O period, capital P period, Wright. He was in charge of security, but Wright had also been a member of the Dallas PD for 30 years, and he was a deputy police chief before he retired. Wright always said that the bullet that I handled, which I then gave to Secret Service agent Richard Johnson in Dallas, who then took the bullet to Washington to give it to James Rowley, who was head of the Secret Service. Neither Rowley nor Johnson ever identified CE 399. And then Rowley gave it to Elma Todd, who's the FBI agent in the DC office, who then gave it to Robert Frazier, who's the expert in the lab. It was said that Frazier had actually, Todd had initialed it initially. And there was a question about the chain of custody. The provenance, we're offering evidence here. Well, what's this legitimacy? So during the course of a trial, you would stand up doing your job and challenge the legitimacy, not regular cross-examination, but wait a minute, where did this bullet come from? Who identified it? We know that Tomlinson says he found it, we're not questioning that, and Wright says he got a bullet, which he claims was the pointed tip. And here's what the government did. Well, they figured, they sealed everything. We're not capable of dealing with the truth. So for 50 years, they just sealed documents from us. This was our president. We elected him. Whether the executive intelligence agencies or anybody in the government doesn't like it, they should read the Constitution. That's a promissory note, if you will, along with the Declaration of Independence. So the question arises, what happened with this bullet? They were concerned. So in 1967, they released Commission Exhibit 2011. And it was a 34-page letterhead that was dated July 7, 64. It said the following: FBI agent Bardwell Odom, O-D-U-M, went to, on June 12th, 64, he went to the Parkland Hospital with the bullet, the CE 399, the magic bullet, the rounded tip, cylindrical in nature, and he interviewed Tomlinson and he interviewed Mr. Wright. And in the report, in this 34-page letterhead memo, the government said, and then both of them sort of said, yeah, it looks like it, sort of looks like it, but I can't say for sure, but it looks like it. They didn't have it initialed, that's why you know for sure. Anyway, Bardwell Odom didn't file, in this case, a 302 report. That's like every police department has a form that's a continuing investigative report. In New York, detectives are DD5s. And they have all these different titles to them. It's just a follow-up investigative report. That's called the 302 in the FBI lingo. It's elementary and it's required. There was no report. So when Bardwell Odom was interviewed, here's what he said. He said, look, the reason there was no 302, of course I know it's elementary, and of course I had a long distinguished career in the FBI. But I didn't file a 302. You know why? I never went to Parkland. I never interviewed Tomlinson. I never interviewed Wright. So the government then released a report in 93 now. And in 93, they said there was an airtel from Dallas FBI that said the following. It was dated June 20th. And it said that neither Tomlinson nor Wright can identify the magic bullet, Commission Exhibit 399. So on the one hand, the July 7 memo, that's Exhibit 2011, what they say initially is, it sounded pretty good. After all, you know, looks like it. Well, they never said it looked like it, because first of all, they were never interviewed by Bardwell Odom. But Wright always maintained that it had a pointed tip. Now, the next area I want to quickly mention is the palm print you heard. And here's the chronology on that. This, if you can believe it, gets worse. Lieutenant of the Dallas PD, J.C. Day, D-A-Y. He gets the rifle, the Mount Carcano. He goes back. He's an expert. He claims he went one day to a course that the FBI gives. And what you do in this business is you dust. You see if you can see a latent print. You photograph before you lift. Because you can lose it in the lift, and you want to photograph to make sure if it was on the left front of a white Mustang where the killer was seated, for example, immediately before he got up and blew the cop away with 4 shots to the back of the head, you want to make sure that you will have a photograph of that fender where the print was seen, the latent print. It's just latent, it's there, but you can't really see it because we touched it and that sort of thing. The dust brings it up. So he sees what he thinks are latent prints after processing the area by the shooting mechanism, trigger, and he sees the latent prints. He covers them with cellophane because he knows that the FBI, FBI agent Vincent Drain in Dallas is going to take all the evidence and take it back to Washington to be examined by the expert lab. And about 8 o'clock at night, somewhere between 8 and 9 at night, he finished photographing and protecting with cellophane those prints that were by the trigger. At about 1:15 to midnight, FBI agent Vincent Drain goes to the Dallas lab, and he's supposed to receive all the evidence from Day. And indeed, he gets all the evidence. So Day says. However, what Day didn't tell him was, nor did he give it to him, nor did he protect it with cellophane, that he lifted a palm print. So, Drain goes to Washington. He doesn't know about the palm print. And later, he was asked, by the way, Day was asked, why didn't you photograph it? Didn't have time. Why not? Because Chief Curry said, stop doing what you're doing, the FBI's coming over. The problem with that story is, in Commission Exhibit 3145 was an interview of Day, who said he was told by Curry to stop around midnight. So from 8 to 9, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, he had at least 2 hours to do this. Take out a camera back in the day, you know, and take a photo. And could you imagine if Agent Drain came and he said, wait a minute, most respectfully, as I sometimes say to His Honor, please, hear me out. You think maybe Drain, rather Day, if it were legitimate, would have said, wait a minute, I got a print here, a palm print off the butt, the underneath portion of the rifle. Let me photograph it, okay? What is Drain going to say? No, I'm on a tight schedule here. This is an alleged murder weapon of the President of the United States. So the rifle goes back to Washington on the 22nd at night. On the 23rd, Chief Curry says in an interview to NBC reporters, he said, none of the latent prints we have are identifiable. That's the morning of the 23rd. Chief of Police. In Washington, at the same time, Sebastian Latona, who's in charge of the lab, is going over the rifle. Well, he sees the prints that were safeguarded. He looks at the photos of them, but he determines after processing them, they're of no value. It means they can't be matched to anybody. He then looks at the rest of the rifle and sees it's not processed. There's no indication of a lift anywhere else, and when you process it, it's covered with this dust. And none of the rest of the rifles, so says Sebastian Latona, who's in charge of the lab in Washington, it wasn't processed. On Sunday, the district attorney of Dallas says Oswald's print are on the weapon, knowing that will be a front page story. Oswald's print on murder weapon across the country. Where'd that come from? So on April 22nd, when Day was interviewed and gave testimony before the Warren Commission, they asked him, and he said, when the rifle was in my possession, I did not have any identifiable prints. He was under oath. I had no identifiable prints. Warren Commission didn't like that. They re-interviewed him. That is the FBI. And he now says to the FBI, you know what, I made a mistake. I must have told Captain Fritz on Friday night and Chief Curry that I lifted the print, the palm print. I just forgot. So they asked him, sign an affidavit that says you lifted that print, that palm print. And he refused. That's the palm print in this case. It's not over. On Sunday night, after Oswald was killed, the FBI shipped the rifle to Dallas. 3 agents were involved. Agent Richard Harrison drove 2 agents to Fort Worth, to Miller's funeral home. And in Fort Worth, these agents had the rifle, they had camera, and they had their crime lab equipment. They went in and stayed with, according to Paul Grudy, who was the director of Miller's funeral home in Fort Worth, they stayed for quite a while. Now, some people will say, hey, gee whiz, Tannenbaum didn't tell you what really goes on. The deceased are always fingerprinted. That's true. And Oswald, on Friday, before he was killed, was fingerprinted 3 times when he was being interviewed by the FBI. You're a prosecutor in the case. We talked about ethics. You're going to put that witness on the stand? This guy who clearly lied? About the palm print? You heard about the palm print here. If you tried that in the Homicide Bureau in New York County when Frank Hogan was a district attorney, you'd wind up handling parking tickets in Staten Island. Now, we talked about some of the scene witnesses, and I want to go back to the scene, because at the scene, I mentioned to you, we talked about Bowers in the tower, Holland on top of the overpass, telling us about the shots that were fired too, he said. He said, the shots, all the shots except the one in his opinion, all the shots came from the rear except the one from the grassy knoll that drew his attention, as well as the other people with him. And what I want to mention is the following. Further corroboration of the shot from the side, from the right front. Police officer Bobby Hargis and his partner, B.J. Martin, were on motorcycles. Now, there were 18 motorcycles flanking the motorcade. Hargis was in back of the left rear. That's the Jackie Kennedy side. So as the car is moving this way, he's back over here. He's in rider. And at the time of the shot, he gets splattered with bone, blood, and brain from the president. It's all over him. He stops his motorcycle and runs, takes his gun out and runs to the grassy knoll. Doesn't run back to the depository. He's covered with brain, blood, and bone from the president. No one gets splattered at all who was on the right rear side. And one of them, Doug Jackson, and his partner was Cheney. But Doug Jackson said, as I was riding, now he's in the right side of the back of the limo, and when he says, when I heard the shot, I looked right over, and I saw the president hit in the right side of the head, and his head flew away. That's from police officer Douglas Jackson. Not a trace of blood on him. Clint Hill was a Secret Service agent, some of you may recall. He ran to the back fender now when he saw all this action. He too is splattered with blood. Let me read to you what he said. He wrote a book. And in the book, Hill said, I jumped onto the left rear step of the president's limo. Mrs. Kennedy shouted. They shot his head off. Remember we heard from the gentleman today and Mr. Hay? You know, there was a question here whether or not the Parkland doctors actually examined the body. These are trauma experts. One of the Parkland doctors who was in charge said, who was in charge of neurosurgery, by the way. There's no rookie ER guy on a contract to be there at night. And you think for 1 second, if you're a trauma room doctor and you're trying to find what's wrong with your patient, you might examine the body to see where the injury is? And the president did not, oh, he's there on his, we don't want to touch the rest of his body. It's sacred material.
10 minutes, Bob.
Now, I jumped onto the left rear step of the limo. Mrs. Kennedy shouted, they shot his head off. I lay over the back and I noticed a portion of the president's head on the right rear side was missing, and he was bleeding profusely. Unlike an earlier shot, and this is from the Secret Service agent Clint Hill, unlike an earlier shot that clearly came from the rear, the killing shot was right. I cannot say for sure that it was rear. This shot had removed a portion of the president's head. The rear right portion of his head was missing. The impact from the right, in the same instant, blood, brain, and matter and bone fragments exploded from the back of the president's head. Now, across the street were two people I want to mention quickly. James Alkins, who was an AP reporter, and Charles Brem. By the way, also in the line of fire over here was a married couple, Bill and Gail Newman, and they had 2 children. They're right in front of the pergola area. They hit the deck and covered their children because they thought the shot was coming over their head from the grassy knoll. That's where they were. And they collapsed down. Line of fire witnesses. James Alkins said the following, and he's always been trotted out by the government, by various news networks to debunk any kind of serious application of all the evidence. And he said, I heard 3 shots, and the president was hit in the back of the head, and the president's head went forward. Simple, that's it. Everybody else who talks, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. I mean, is James Alkins part of this vast conspiracy? It turns out, here's what he actually said. The last shot came from the rear and hit the president's head. He's right. The last shot, which I showed to you, the 5th shot, came from the rear. We know that for several reasons. We know it because it enlarged the head wound, and it struck the interior, a fragment struck the interior of the limo to the left of the rear view mirror. We know at frame 255, nothing happened to the car. Both Kennedy and Connolly were shot at frame 255. Remember at frame 224, the president is hit, he braces. 230, Connolly's still holding the hat. He's holding that hat up until 328. And we see from the framing of all this that we know now that the boom booms, according to Holland, according to Alkins, was the last shot that came from the rear. Alkins raises his camera, and within a half a second, or actually 7/10 of a second when you measure it out, he misses the shot from the grassy knoll. But here's what he sees. The president already slumped, immobile, he says, and then his head went forward. This was a regular major inconsistency in the whole tale. And we now know it's reconciled. He was right. The last shot did hit him in the back of the head, and his head did go forward. But first it snapped back because of the impact. The other witness is Charles Brem. Charles Brem is very interesting because he was at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day. In 1944, on June 6th, he was at Pointe du Hoc on the Normandy beaches. Pointe du Hoc was the steepest cliff where the Germans had their heavy guns. And he was one of those rangers who actually scaled up that incredible cliff where they'd taken heavy fire. So he got shot during the campaign and an in and out from his chest, back to front. And he knew a crack of a bullet passed him. And here's what he says. He too was near Alkins. And he says, I think there were 3 shots. The first shot hit the president, he braced. The second shot blew his head off. That's the shot he saw from the knoll. He said the third shot cracked past me. He had a 5-year-old son with him. He went down on the ground. He went down on the ground and covered his son. He thought there was going to be a shootout. But he was right. The last shot did come from the rear. He missed the sequencing of it, but he's telling us why. Here's why. We know what he's telling us fits the whole scenario of what the facts are from the witnesses, as well as the science. And that is the following. If he misses, he's in back of the first volley. That never hits him. It doesn't pass him. The shot from the null doesn't pass him. The one shot that passes him is the last shot. That's why he hears the crack. If it were otherwise, if it was the theory of the Warren Commission, and there were only 3 shots, but the last shot came from the rear, there would have been no cracking. He would have heard the cracking on what he says. The shot that hit Kennedy was the second shot. There would never have been a third shot. But the third shot cracks past him, and he's already seen the president hit, and then he sees him hit in the head, and then he hears that cracking. So these are not witnesses who in any way are adversarial, contradictory. Now, I want to move on to a very important point that has been made, and I think that the time has come. But first, I want to mention to you the Parkland doctors. There's been an issue about what they actually said and saw. And here it goes. Dr. Kemp Clark was chief of neurosurgery in the room. He was in charge of making sure that they would do everything they could to save the president's life. He said the lower right occipital bone was blown out and I saw the cerebellum. So much for that. Wait a minute.
In about 7 minutes, we have a witness coming on telephone.
Yeah, I know, Your Honor. I'm going to ask you to, I'll take it out of the witness's time if I have to. 1 second.
Only if I let you.
I know, I said that, Your Honor. I'm pleading with you right now. I'm pleading. I just have a little more to go. This is a picture, a diagram of the back of the president's head as Dr. Robert McClellan okayed this. He didn't do it himself, it was done for him. And this is what we call the parietal bone and the occipital bone. The parietal is up here, the occipital is down here. And Robert McClellan examined the wound. He said he examined the head wound. Right rear portion of skull was blasted. Dr. Malcolm Perry, large avulsive, meaning exploded, wound in the right occipital parietal area. Dr. Marion Jenkins, wound in the back of JFK's head was an exit wound. Large gaping wound in the right occipital parietal area. Dr. James Carrico. Now, a quick note. I left this committee because I knew they went search for truth. I didn't think they would do what I'm about to tell you they did. They sealed the minutes. They sealed all the documents for 50 years. But they gave a report that was done in like the summertime, the late summer, early fall, whatever, of 78. They were going out of business on December 31st, 78. And what they said was the following. Follow this. The doctors, this is from the Forensic Medical Panel, page 37. Get your hands on it. It speaks volumes about what's going on. It said the following, and they knowingly sealed all the documents for 50 years. It said, all of the Parkland doctors must be mistaken because all 26 witnesses at Bethesda did not see a gaping hole in the back of the president's head, and God knows, these forensic pathologists, they know everything about what's going on. I had a lawyer tell me from the committee, not a long time ago, never interviewed the Parkland doctors. Why? Why should I? I had all their notes. How about asking Dr. Kemp, you said you saw the cerebellum. What else did you see? Who was with you? Who else looked at the back of the president and said, you might want to question these witnesses? Some of the forensic pathologists told him, you don't have to, they don't know anything, they're ER people. We're the ones who look at all the organs. Now, here's what happened. All of the Parkland doctors must be mistaken about the gaping hole in the back of the president's head because all the witnesses at Bethesda said they didn't see it. This is not a mistake. This is a calculated lie. Why? At least 15 people at Bethesda gave memorializations and testimony to the House committee saying they saw a gaping hole in the back of the president's head. How's this sound? The 3 autopsists, 2 FBI agents, Silbert and O'Neill, 3 Secret Service, 5 technicians, 1 Navy corpsman, a mortician. I could go on. I have a list here for you. This is a list of over 50 witnesses who have seen the back of the president's head, both at the scene and doctors, at Bethesda and Parkland. The gaping hole, you can see the doctors all indicating, and the regular civilian witnesses. You look at this. Your Honor, please consider this a demarked people's, the people of the United States of America. Exhibit 27.
You can say it's a state of Texas. Okay?
The state of Texas.
Thank you.
The great state of Texas.
Even better.
Okay, the point I want to make now is we heard today several times that there was no evidence, no physical evidence or x-rays that show the shot from the grassy knoll. Now let me show you something. Your Honor, this is one of the 26, and it shows a skeletal structure of the president's head, and there's a rectangle for emphasis purposes. And in it is a fuzzy gray area of minute metallic fragments. It's in the right upper area above in the temple area above the right ear.
The record will so reflect.
Thank you, Your Honor. And you want evidence? Here we go. This will put the lie to what you heard. These are little fragments. They're tiny, minute, metallic fragments. And here's the significance of them. They create a fuzzy gray area like a cloud. Large, when a bullet hits the head, for example, and the bone structure here, the cranial vault, if you will, protecting the brain, is a solid substance, and it's likely that there will be fragmentation of the bullet. Large fragments continue to penetrate. They have that power and energy. That's the blast out of the head. Tiny metallic fragments create a missile dust. And experts in this field will tell you, and you're going to hear from some this afternoon, but you don't need them. You can see it. You see two things here. You see this little stream of tiny fragments. They tell you the direction of the fragment line. They also tell you the point of entry. Why? Because the tiny ones can't move. They have no power. They have no energy. But what's interesting about this portrayal here of the president's head, you can see he's superimposed on his face here, is that they get larger as you go to the end of the small end of the triangle, of the rectangle. They're getting larger. The small missile dust is at the point of entry area. You want evidence, you take a look at this. This is scientific evidence. It deals with ballistics, if you will. It's hardcore. It's not my opinion. You can see it. How come we didn't hear about this today? Now, one last shot. The acoustic evidence. In the fall area, summer fall of '78, the committee came upon a dictabelt that was supplied to them by Mary Farrell, who was a researcher. And what happened was,
Counsel,
unbeknownst...
Can I stop you? Will you explain to some of the folks here what a dictaphone is? Because some don't know.
What a what? What a what?
What a dictaphone is.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a recording made by the apparatus, the recording machines that are on the motorcycles. And they then put it on a series of, all the impulses and sounds are placed on a dictabelt, and then they analyze it. In this case, they didn't know it. And Officer McLean, who was a motorcycle operator, didn't know it, but he had his microphone jammed on. And the Dallas PD heard this stuff, and they were giving him out, and it got to the committee in Washington. And the committee in Washington decided, we got to have acoustic experts look at it, right? So they called up the Acoustical Society of America. They said, who's the best lab in the country to analyze this? And they said Bolt, Baranak, and Newman. They're in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Good for good cause. When Judge Sirica handled the Watergate tapes, Both Baranek and Newman analyzed them during the Nixon situation. They also created Operation Boomerang. Right now, in all our Humvees in the military, where our guys and women are, they have a computer. And it's an anti-sniper device that both Baranek and Newman created. And as soon as incoming enemy fire comes, bango, based upon acoustical testing and the ability of them to echo these effects, just like sonar, you know, ping, ping, they were able to tell exactly our soldiers where those shots came from, the sniper. So, in addition, they were called by the Justice Department to examine the tapes that were made at Kent State, the Kent State shooting of the protesters. Kent State National Guard claimed that it was shot by, they responded to fire from the protesters. Both Baranek and Newman analyzed it, no shots came. They determined from the protesters it all came from the National Guard. In this case, they went to Dealey Plaza. They went to the northeast end of, they were hired by the committee. They went to the northeast end where the complex of buildings are. They took shots so that they would know exactly what a shot sounded like in that area. And of course, the small nature of the area, there's a lot of ricochet stuff. You know, you heard the great Lou Gehrig speech when he had this terrible disease. And in Yankee Stadium, he said on July 4th weekend, he said, I feel as though I am the luckiest. And you heard the echo, the luckiest, lucky. Because an echo is a direct replica of what was said or heard or shot. And here's what they came up with. They studied the Z film, the Zapruder film. And there was a synchronization. There was a total synchronization of frame 313, the shot that hits the president above the right temple. And many of the committee members wanted to see what the synchronization was. So about 8 of them got together with their counsel, the lawyer for the committee, and there was the expert there, who was their video person, Robert Grodin. Grodin says he was told by the lawyer to keep his mouth shut. If he did, there would be repercussions. This is the search for truth.
3 minutes to wrap up. I got somebody waiting on the phone to get on. Let's wrap it up.
I'm going to try, Ryan. I'm wrapping up. This is wrap up called.
Thank you.
And the committee looked at 313 and said, guess what? This is exactly where the shot came from, the 4th shot. Oh, no, said the counsel. It couldn't be. What do you mean it couldn't be? We're synchronizing here. We don't have any medical evidence. We have no medical evidence to show the shot came from the right front. So they said, okay, I guess it came from that was the last shot then. The acoustic people can't be right. Well, the bottom line here is the committee wasn't satisfied. They called up the American Acoustical Society and they said, who's the second best? What is the second best? And they said Queens College, their computer science department. Why? Because they're involved in programming sonar on all our ships. They came up with more certitude. And you'll hear how in a Ramsey report, without an acoustical expert on it, said that they're wrong. You'll hear that from our witnesses. And we'll distinguish it with an expert. But here's the kicker. Why would the committee lie and put the Parkland doctors in a situation where they were know-nothings? Why? There's a reason, isn't there? If you believe, and from the evidence, beyond any and all doubt, we know that if you believe the Parkland doctors and all the other people I gave you right here to look at, over 50, that the back of the president's head was blown out, it happened from the grassy knoll. I'm not here representing any group. I'm an amicus to this court, to this group. Oswald could not have killed the president if the shot from the grassy knoll killed him, notwithstanding the 5th shot that moved him forward from the force, enlarged the wound. That's why. Evil is smart, deceitful, and clever. And ultimately, when everyone realizes that, we'll know how to really deal with evil. We've done pretty well so far. There is more for me to go into. Your Honor, do I have anything else? I don't want to press it too much, but...
Then don't. We have a witness waiting on the telephone
Your Honor,
to testify.
Your Honor, I want to thank you very much
Yes, sir.
Thank you all very much. God bless you and God bless America.
So Bob, Dr. McClellan's going to be calling in a minute.
Sure.